Before we delve into the reading of the primary source of the non-aligned movement policies in the 1980s, you will see a little bit of a reflection upon the context of these policies. It's located within the history of Indian politics. We've seen previously setting up the context of the non-aligned movement meeting in India in 1983, the emergence of the leadership of Indira Gandhi, not Mahatma Gandhi, but Indira Gandhi as part of Jawaharlal Nehru's family, his daughter most specifically, although she had very different politics. Since Gandhi had lost her seat in the election, the defeated Congress Party appointed Yashwantrao Shavanas as their parliamentary party leader. Soon afterwards, the Congress Party split between a pro-Gandhi faction, with Gandhi floating her own Congress faction yet again, and an anti-Gandhi faction. However, she would win by election from the Chikmagalur constituency to the Lok Sabha in November of 1978. The Janata Party government's Home Minister Chaudhary Charan Singh ordered the arrest of her and Sanjay Gandhi on several charges, none of which would be easy to prove in an Indian court. The arrest meant that Indira Gandhi was automatically expelled from the parliament, however, an important shift, and these allegations included that she had, quote, planned or thought of killing all opposition leaders in jail during the emergency. In response to her arrest, Indira Gandhi's supporters hijacked an Indian Airlines jet and demanded her immediate release. However, this strategy backfired disastrously. Her arrest and long-running trial gained her great sympathy from many people. The Janata Coalition was the only coalition that was present in the Lok Sabha, and it was only really united by its distaste for Gandhi, or that woman, as some would call her, in a pejorative and frankly misogynistic fashion. The party included right-wing Hindu nationalists and also left-wing communists, but greatly the right-wing nationalists would take control. With so little in common, Morarji Desai's government was simply bogged down by infighting. In 1979, the government started to unravel, and the issue of dual loyalties from several members of the Janata Party and the RSS emerged. The ambitious Union Finance Minister Charan Singh, who was as the Union Home Minister during the previous year, had ordered the arrest of Gandhi, took advantage of this and started courting the Congress. After a significant exodus from the party to Charan Singh's faction, Morarji Desai resigned in July 1979. Then Charan Singh was appointed Prime Minister by President Reddy after Indira and Sanjay Gandhi promised Singh that the Congress would support his government from outside on certain negotiated preconditions. The conditions included dropping all charges against Indira and Sanjay. Since Charan Singh refused to drop the charges, the Congress withdrew its support, and President Reddy dissolved the parliament in August of 1979, leading to emergency 1980 elections. Before the 1980 elections, Gandhi appointed then Shahi Imam of Jama Masjid, Syed Abdullah Bukhari, and entered into an agreement with him on the basis of a 10-point program to secure the support of Muslim votes leading into the election season. In the elections in January, Congress then returned to power with a landslide victory. The Congress under Gandhi swept back to power through this landslide victory in all states at all levels in January of 1980. Elections soon after to state assemblies across the country resulted in Congress ministries and Indira's son Sanjay choosing loyalists to lead the states. On June 23rd, Gandhi's son Sanjay, however, was killed in an air crash while performing an aerobic maneuver in New Delhi. Gandhi by this stage only trusted family members and therefore persuaded her reluctant son Rajiv to enter politics. This forms the background of that non-aligned movement in India in 1983, as well as several other considerations. One, the movement was focused on meeting in neutral states. It could not meet, therefore, in its originally planned location in Baghdad, in Iraq, because Iraq had just invaded Iran, and Iraq was being backed by the United States, with arms being funneled to Saddam Hussein by the United States during this invasion of Iran. The Southeast Asian delegations were perhaps the most critical faction of the Non-Aligned Movement Conference in India in 1983. Southeast Asia was emerging as an international regionalist sort of organization of states gradually over the course of the 1960s through the 1980s. The government of Thailand had put down the Communist Party of Thailand in a brutally repressive campaign over the course of the 1960s and the 1980s. The Second Indochina War was fought in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from 1955 through 1975, which resulted in 1973 in an American defeat in Southeast Asia. But additionally, Indonesia had put down the Partai Communist of Indonesia and led an associated genocidal campaign from 1965 through 1966. The Malaysian-Chinese riots of 1969 in Kuala Lumpur, in British Malaya and Malaysia, former British Malaya, now Malaysia, and then also Singapore, led to a state of emergency proclaimed in Malaysia. In the mid-1960s, the Marcos regime came to power in the Philippines. The Marcos regime would rule the archipelago over the course of 2 decades, backed by the United States with a brutally repressive dictatorship. In the case of Burma, Ne Win's coup d'etat would take place in Burma in 1962, and there would be a single-party head of state in Burma, what is now Myanmar, from 1962 to 1988. Over the course of the 1960s through the 1970s, the promise of democracy in Southeast Asia had been stamped out, ironically at the behest of the United States, and also the promise of multi-party states had been stamped out as well. At the beginning of the 1980s, there were simply no governments in Southeast Asia that could be called pluralistic multi-party democracies. This being said, the Southeast Asian factions leading into the Non-Aligned Movement meeting in 1983 were advocates of self-rule, democracy, and non-aligned movement status. The movement was essentially the 7th Non-Aligned Movement Summit. It took place in Delhi from March 7th through March 11th, and it was headed by the President and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia in collaboration with the government of Indira Gandhi in India. The Indian government sort of led this, but the Indonesian government had played a substantial role. Speakers at the conference included the Prime Minister of Malaysia, the Deputy Prime Minister of the Republic of Singapore, and the Chair of Council of Ministers of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, one of the youngest states in the region, which had been formed after the reunification of the Republic of Vietnam and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1975, with a new constitution founding the modern Socialist Republic of Vietnam in 1976. Speaking on behalf of the Indonesian delegation at the conference, Mokhtar Kusumatmadja opened the conference with thanking India for appreciation for Iraq, perhaps with a sort of shout out to Castro for his excellent leadership over 3 years, celebrating the new membership of states such as the Bahamas, Barbados, Vanuatu, and Colombia, as well as Santa Lucia, Belize, and Ecuador. He then went on to make 3 points: peace, disarmament, and development for ASEAN states, for Southeast Asian states, and for Indian Ocean states. He wanted to establish an ASEAN pact against nuclear involvement. He also promoted the defense of SWATO, or the liberation movements in Namibia, Lesotho, and Mozambique. He spoke against the governments of Israel and the annexation of the Golan Heights. He called for the removal of UK interventions in southern Argentina, the Falklands, and then also to reschedule the debt of non-aligned movement nations, to increase lending limits, and for more possibilities for loan forgiveness as well, clearly picking up a thread from Prebish's policies in his speech. Prime Minister of Malaysia, Muhammad Mahathir's appearance in the 1983 Non-Aligned Movement Conference in India was unique, as he was the single head of state to appear at the conference himself. In the course of his speech, he argued for the removal of, quote, foreign troops from Lebanon, from Afghanistan, read the Soviet Union here, as well as potentially from the support of what would later become the Mujahideen, the pro-Saudi Arabian financier of the Mujahideen, and their American backers. But he also called for the removal of foreign troops from Cambodia, throwing shade, if you will, at Pham Van Dong of Vietnam, as Vietnam had just occupied Cambodia, beginning in 1979 to overthrow the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime. Yes, in fact, the Vietnamese communists saved the Cambodian people from further persecution of the Khmer Rouge in this instance, but remained as occupiers in Cambodia until 1989. So this was throwing a bit of shade at the Democratic Republic, now Socialist Republic of Vietnam. He also argued, somewhat controversially, that the DK regime should have had a seat at the table. Keep in mind that the United States recognized the DK regime, the nominally communist, but really just ethno-nationalist government of Cambodia that had been ousted by the Vietnamese, and that the reasoning for this was simply because they were anti-Vietnamese. He also explicitly congratulated the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Movement leader, Yasser Arafat, on being elected again in the state of Palestine. There was no mention of ASEAN or Indian Ocean cooperation in his speech, however, and he stood against the division of Antarctica among states, which was somewhat given for non-aligned movement, and he wanted to protect Antarctica, to establish it purely as a neutral territory, a position that would never come to be. Speaking on behalf of the Republic of Singapore, Rajaratnam would lead his speech at the conference with several positions. He is the second Deputy Prime Minister Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Singapore, and he would claim that all wars since 1945, except Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, have been between Third World actors, pointing out that many member states of the Third World movement were not holding towards their platform of peaceful coexistence. Nonetheless, he would also highlight a particularly important stance and commentary on American involvement in international affairs. As he noted, quote, "I suspect the Americans are not unlike their more experienced and dedicated Soviet rivals, particularly good at political conspiracy. This may be because, unlike Soviet conspirators, American conspirators tend to talk too much. The key speaker for the non-aligned movement in 1983, whose reading and speech you should focus on most, is the chair of the Council of Ministers of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Pham Van Dam cites Havana as his inspiration for the non-aligned movement, shifting the inspiration away from Bandung and towards Havana in his vision. He opens his speech, "Cradle of culture that has given birth to noble spiritual values and marvelous works of art, crucible of the Mahabharata and Ramayana epics, and laborious and valiant workers, homeland of Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Rabindranath Tagore. India is a country that has made important contributions to the nation's peace, independence, and freedom on this continent and in the world. India is steadily developing her economy and culture and solving many highly difficult problems that face the large country. The Green Revolution in India has allowed a fast growth in the productivity and the production of food grain, and thus for the essential putting to an end of an age-old food shortage. India's industry, with the potential growth and with its achievements, is ranking 10th in the world and has attained an advanced level in a number of important sectors of the economy and is steadily making headway. Note that the opening is all about India and not about Vietnam. Pham Van Dam, in addition to citing Havana as an inspiration for the non-aligned movement, would cite the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, as an inspiration for the fight against imperialism worldwide. He also aimed to broaden what he called South-to-South cooperation in economy, science, and technology, taking an explicit stand against U.S. imperialism and demanding that the U.S. dismantle military bases in the Indian Ocean zone. He issued statements of support for the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Movement, SWATO, and Namibian independence, while clarifying that the Socialist Republic of Vietnam would, at some point, withdraw from Cambodia. A sort of sentiment like, yes, yes, we will get on to that eventually. For your post, go ahead and make some contrasting points. Note any surprising points from these speeches that jump out to you, and let's get the discussion going.